Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we explore the most chilling and mysterious tales from around the world. Tonight, we venture deep into the shadowy forests to uncover terrifying encounters with the legendary Dogman. From the dense woods of Pine Barrens to the eerie silence of Snoqualmie, these 10 spine-chilling stories of Dogman sightings will make you think twice before your next camping trip. Dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to face the fearsome Dogman. Story number 1. The Nightmare in the Appalachians. The Appalachian Mountains are as old as time itself. There's something about them, something deep in the dark hollows and dense forests that feels untouched, primal, and almost sentient. I never gave much thought to the stories of strange creatures and unexplainable events out there. I thought they were just campfire tales, told to scare newcomers or sell books. But one weekend in late October, the mountains made a believer out of me. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just me, my brother Chris, and our 2 friends, Danny and Lisa. Chris had this idea that we should go camping on the Appalachian Trail to unplug and enjoy nature. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of sleeping on the ground for 2 nights, but he convinced me it would be fun. Think of it as an adventure, he said. I wish I'd told him no. We set out early on a Saturday morning, hiking deep into the forest until we found a secluded spot off the main trail. The clearing was perfect, flat, quiet, surrounded by towering oaks and maples that still clung to their last fiery leaves. By the time we set up camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp, carrying that unmistakable scent of autumn and earth. The first night was uneventful. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, shared a flask of whiskey Danny had smuggled in, and told ghost stories until Lisa declared she was too creeped out to continue. We all laughed and crawled into our tents, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees lulling us to sleep. The second night, though, that was when everything went wrong. It started with the howling. First, I thought it was just coyotes. The sound was distant, faint, and carried on the wind. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't the high-pitched yipping of coyotes, though it was deeper, guttural, and it seemed to echo through the trees. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before. None of us had. "What the hell is that?" Lisa whispered, clutching her sleeping bag to her chest. Chris, trying to sound brave, shrugged. "Probably just wolves or something. They won't come near us." But even he didn't sound convinced. The howling grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from all around us. Danny grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, sticking his head out to look around. "I don't see anything," he said, his voice shaking. "Close it," Lisa hissed. "Close it and stay inside." Danny did as she said, and we all sat there in silence, listening. The howls stopped, replaced by something worse. The sound of branches snapping, heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving through the underbrush. Chris leaned closer to me. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my throat dry. The footsteps were slow at first, as if whatever was out there was circling us. Then they stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind that makes your ears strain for any sound. And then, from just beyond the tents, came the growl. It was low and guttural, vibrating through the ground beneath us. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. Sounded wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. Danny grabbed the flashlight again. "I'm going out there." "No," Lisa hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't be stupid." But Danny was already unzipping the tent. He stepped out, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The rest of us followed, staying close together, our breaths fogging in the cold night air. "Do you see anything?" Chris asked, his voice trembling. Danny didn't answer. He was frozen, the flashlight trembling in his hand. I followed the beam of light, and that's when I saw it. First, it was just a shadow, a massive shape standing between 2 trees about 20 feet away. But as the light hit it, the details came into focus. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with long, powerful limbs and a body covered in sleek, black fur that seemed to absorb the light. Its ears were pointed, its snout long and filled with sharp, gleaming teeth, but it was the eyes that froze me in place, burning. Amber eyes that seemed to see straight through me. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. Back to the tents, Chris whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us moved. The creature lowered itself slightly, its muscles rippling beneath its fur. It looked ready to lunge. Lisa let out a small whimper, and the creature's ears twitched, locking onto the sound. "Run," I whispered. We turned and bolted, stumbling back toward the tents. The creature let out a roar, a deep, guttural sound that rattled my bones, and I heard it crashing through the underbrush behind us. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed to keep running. We made it to the tents and grabbed whatever we could. Flashlights. A knife. Nothing that would actually help. The creature stopped just short of the clearing, its glowing eyes watching us from the shadows. It let out another growl, and for a moment, I thought it was going to charge. Then we shined the flashlights on it. The creature reared back, snarling, its eyes narrowing against the light. It let out a deafening roar, then turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't sleep that night. We sat huddled together by the fire, clutching flashlights and listening for any sound. The forest was silent, but the smell lingered, a foul stench like wet fur and rotting meat. When dawn finally broke, we packed up and left, leaving behind most of our gear. As we made our way back to the trailhead, we saw them footprints, massive prints, larger than any wolf or bear, with claws that dug deep into the earth. They circled our campsite, leading off into the forest where the creature had disappeared. I haven't been back to the Appalachians since. Whatever's out there, it's not something that belongs in this world. The locals talk about strange things in those woods, creatures that shouldn't exist, things that watch from the shadows. If you ever find yourself in the Appalachians and you hear something howling in the night, do yourself a favor. Don't look for it. And whatever you do, don't run. Story number 2. The Dogman in Pine Barrens. The Pine Barrens in New Jersey isn't just any forest. It's a place steeped in mystery and folklore. The kind of place where the trees whisper your secrets back to you and the darkness feels alive. People talk about the Jersey Devil, ghost stories, and all sorts of strange happenings. But the locals know better. They talk about something else, something they don't like to name. They just call it Dogman. I never believed in those stories until that night in late October. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Me, my friend Kevin, and his girlfriend Sarah thought it would be fun to spend a weekend in the Barrens. Kevin had been there before and claimed to know the area well enough to keep us out of trouble. It's not as creepy as people say, he told us on the drive out. Just a lot of trees and old legends. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the dense canopy of pine trees. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decay. Felt old, like the forest had been here long before us and would outlast us all. I brushed off the unease. It was just a forest, nothing more. We set up camp in a small clearing a mile or so off the main trail. By the time we had the tent up and a fire going, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in a silvery twilight. Kevin was in high spirits, cracking jokes and throwing twigs into the fire, while Sarah and I shared stories about Halloween and urban legends. It was shaping up to be a normal night until the smell hit. First, I thought it was something rotting. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of wet dog, decaying meat, and sulfur. It made my eyes water and my stomach turn. Jesus, what is that? Sarah said, covering her nose with her sleeve. Kevin stood up, sniffing the air. Probably a dead animal nearby, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. I'll check it out. Don't, I said, a sudden sense of dread washing over me. Just leave it. It's probably nothing. Kevin laughed. You're scared of a smell? Before I could stop him, he grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the edge of the clearing, the beam cutting through the darkness. I stayed by the fire with Sarah, both of us silent, listening to the faint crunch of Kevin's footsteps on the pine needles. That's when we heard the growl. It was low, guttural, and deep enough to make the ground vibrate. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" "Kevin," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The growl came again, louder this time, and closer. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. Too deep for a dog, too sharp for a bear. It was wrong, primal, something that didn't belong. Kevin stumbled back into the clearing, his face pale. "There's something out there," he said, his voice shaking. "What did you see?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. Eyes, red eyes, watching me. The smell grew stronger, the stench wrapping around us like a living thing. The growling was louder now, coming from all around us, as if whatever was out there wasn't alone. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Kevin shook his head. "We can't. It's too dark to find the trail. We just need to stay by the fire." But the fire didn't feel like protection. The shadows seemed to press closer, the darkness alive with movement. Every now and then, I thought I saw something, a shape darting between the trees, too fast to make out. And then we saw it. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. First, it was just a shadow, but as our eyes adjusted, we could see more. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, with a hunched, muscular frame covered in thick, matted fur. Its legs were bent backward, like a dog's, but its upper body was almost human. Its arms were long, ending in clawed hands that hung low at its sides. And its head was unmistakably canine, with a long snout and sharp, glinting teeth. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. They glowed red, burning like embers, and they were locked on us. "Don't move," Kevin whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature lowered itself slightly, its claws digging into the ground. It was watching us, calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. The growling grew louder, resonating in my chest, and I thought my heart might stop. Then, suddenly, it lunged. Sarah screamed, and Kevin grabbed a burning log from the fire, swinging it wildly. The creature stopped short, snarling, its teeth bared. The light from the fire danced across its fur, highlighting muscles that rippled with every movement. For a moment, we were locked in a standoff, the creature circling just outside the firelight, its growls filling the air. "Turn on the flashlights," I shouted, grabbing mine and flicking it on. The beam hit the creature square in the face, and it recoiled, letting out an ear-splitting roar. Kevin and Sarah followed suit, their flashlights creating a triangle of light that seemed to hold it at bay. The creature snarled one last time, then turned and bolted into the darkness, its massive frame disappearing into the trees. We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the fire, flashlights in hand, jumping at every sound. The smell lingered, a sick reminder of what we'd seen. When dawn finally broke, we packed up and left, abandoning most of our gear in our rush to escape. As we made our way back to the trailhead, we saw them, footprints, deep and clear in the soft earth. They were massive, larger than any animal I knew, with distinct claw marks at the tips. They followed the trail for a while before veering off into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I haven't been back to the Pine Barrens since, and I don't plan to. Whatever's out there is not just a legend. It's real, and it's watching. If you ever find yourself in those woods and you smell something foul, or hear a low growl in the dark, do yourself a favor, run. Story number 3. The Dogman encounter in Snoqualmie Forest. Thanksgiving weekend was supposed to be an escape. My wife, Sarah, and I decided to take the kids, Ben and Emily, on a camping trip to Snoqualmie Forest. We wanted to trade the chaos of family gatherings for the serenity of the woods. where we could roast marshmallows under the stars and tell ghost stories around the fire. I didn't know we'd end up living one. The day was peaceful, almost idyllic. The kids spent hours exploring the trails around our campsite while Sarah and I set up the tent and gathered firewood. Snoqualmie was breathtaking, with its towering evergreens and the sound of a distant creek weaving through the silence. By nightfall, we were huddled around the fire, sharing laughs as the flames crackled and danced. It was the kind of night that made you forget the world existed until the first sound shattered the peace. It started as a faint rustling, barely audible over the fire. I dismissed it as the wind or a small animal scurrying through the underbrush. But then it grew louder, closer. The sound wasn't random like an animal foraging. It was deliberate, heavy, like something or someone circling the campsite. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably a deer," I said, trying to sound calm. But the way the hairs on my neck stood on end betrayed me. Ben and Emily had gone quiet, their marshmallows forgotten. We all strained to listen as the sound grew closer, now accompanied by a low, rhythmic breathing. It was deep and guttural, the kind of sound that makes your chest tighten and your mind race. I grabbed the flashlight and stood, scanning the edge of the clearing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and shadows. "Maybe it's a bear," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "No," I said. "A bear would have gone straight for the food." The breathing grew louder, more distinct, and then it stopped. That's when I saw it. It stepped into the edge of the flashlight beam, and for a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The figure was massive, at least 7 feet tall, standing on 2 legs with hunched shoulders that seemed to ripple with muscle. His body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its long arms ended in clawed hands that hung unnervingly low. But it was the face that froze me in place. It was like a wolf, but wrong, its snout too long, his jaw filled with jagged, yellow teeth that glinted in the light. Its eyes glowed a vivid, unnatural red, locking onto me with a predatory intensity that made my stomach churn. It growled, a low, vibrating sound that felt like it came from the ground itself. The smell hit me then, a rancid, overwhelming stench of decay and wet fur that made my eyes water. Sarah screamed, snapping me out of my stupor. I fumbled with the flashlight, pointing it directly at the creature. The beam seemed to startle it. It let out a deafening roar that echoed through the forest, his head snapping back in what looked like rage. "Get in the tent," I shouted, my voice cracking. Sarah pulled the kids inside, zipping it shut as I stood there, frozen between running and standing my ground. The creature took a step forward, its claws sinking into the dirt, and I felt my legs begin to tremble. It bared its teeth, saliva dripping from its maw as it growled again. Louder this time. I don't know what made me do it, but I shone the flashlight directly into its eyes. The creature flinched, raising one massive arm to shield its face, and then it let out a final, guttural roar before turning and bolting into the forest. The speed was unnatural, its movements fluid and silent despite its size. Within seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. But the smell lingered. We didn't sleep that night. The kids huddled together, their faces pale and tear-streaked, while Sarah and I sat in silence, listening for any sign that the creature had returned. The smell of decay clung to the air, making it impossible to forget what we'd seen. The first light, we packed up everything we could carry and left the rest behind. The hike back to the car was tense, every rustling leaf and snapping twig making my heart race. When we finally reached the safety of the vehicle, I felt a weight lift, though the memory of those red eyes stayed with me. Later, I tried to rationalize what we'd seen. A bear with mange, maybe, or some kind of elaborate prank. But nothing explained the size, the speed, or the way it stood upright like a man. And nothing explained those eyes. I started researching Dogman stories, and the similarities were chilling. The red eyes, the growls, the stench, dozens of accounts matched what we'd experienced. Some even came from the same area of Snoqualmie Forest. We never went camping again. Even now, years later, I can still hear that growl in my nightmares. I can still see the glowing eyes staring at me through the trees, filled with a hunger that no animal could possess. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can still smell that awful, rotting stench. If you ever find yourself in Snoqualmie Forest, be careful, because some stories aren't just stories, and some things are better left unseen. Story number 4. Dogman in the Black Forest. The Black Forest had always seemed like a fairy tale to me. I'd grown up hearing stories about its dark, ancient trees and the legends that whispered through them. Tales of witches, lost travelers, and strange creatures that lurked where the light couldn't reach. So, when my husband, David, suggested we take a camping trip there with our 2 kids, I was both thrilled and uneasy. "It's just a forest," David had said, laughing as he packed the car. "What's the worst that could happen?" Now I know. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. The forest was vast, its towering pines stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was cool and heavy, carrying the scent of moss and damp earth. Our campsite was tucked away in a small clearing, surrounded by trees so dense they felt like walls. The kids, Ellie and Max, were excited, chasing each other around the tents as David started a fire. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I dismissed it as nerves. After all, this was what we wanted, a break from the chaos of life, a chance to disconnect and reconnect with nature. By the time the fire was roaring, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in shadow. We cooked sausages and marshmallows, telling stories and laughing under the canopy of stars. For a moment, it was perfect, and then we heard it. It started as a faint rustling in the trees, just beyond the firelight. First, I thought it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but then came the growl, well, guttural and resonant. It froze the laughter in my throat. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to David, clutching his arm. He nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Probably just a fox," he said, though his voice was tight. But the growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. "Stay here," David said, grabbing the flashlight. "I'll check it out." "Don't," pleaded, but he was already stepping away from the fire. David's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in stark, shifting beams. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. And then we saw it. It stepped into the edge of the light, a massive figure covered in dark, matted fur, stood upright, easily over 7 feet tall, its broad shoulders and long limbs radiating raw power. Its head was wolf-like, with pointed ears, a long snout, and a mouth full of sharp, gleaming teeth. But its eyes burned a vivid, unnatural red, locking onto us with a predator's intensity. "David," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Get back here." The creature growled, a deep, vibrating sound that made my chest tighten. Took a step forward, its movements fluid and unervingly fast for something so large. David backed toward the fire, the flashlight trembling in his hand. "Everyone get in the car," he said, his voice low but urgent. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing the kids and making for the car park just beyond the clearing. The creature roared, a sound so loud and guttural it seemed to shake the ground. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it moving, faster than any human or animal, its claws tearing through the dirt as it charged toward us. "Run!" David shouted. We reached the car, throwing open the doors and piling inside as the creature closed the distance. David jammed the keys into the ignition, his hands shaking, and the engine roared to life just as the creature reached us. It slammed into the side of the car, the impact rocking the vehicle. Ellie screamed as its claws raked against the windows, leaving deep gouges in the glass. Its red eyes glared at us through the windshield, its teeth bared in a snarl. "Go!" I yelled, and David floored the gas. The car tore down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. But the creature didn't stop. It chased us, its long legs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. I could hear its claws scraping against the road, its growls filling the air. "Is it still there?" Ellie cried. I turned to look and saw it. Its massive form illuminated briefly in the red glow of the taillights. It leapt into the air, landing just feet behind us, its claws reaching for the bumper. "Faster!" I screamed, clutching the kids. The road curved, and for a moment, the creature fell back, its form disappearing into the shadows. But its roar echoed through the trees, a sound that seemed to follow us long after we'd left the forest behind. We didn't stop until we reached a small gas station miles away. The car was scratched and dented, the windows streaked with claw marks. The attendant gave us a strange look as we stumbled inside, our faces pale and our breaths coming in ragged gasps. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Something in the forest," David said, his voice hollow. "Something not human." We never went back to the Black Forest. We left our tents, our gear, everything behind. For weeks, I had nightmares about those red eyes, that guttural growl, the feeling of being hunted. The kids still refuse to talk about it, and David shuts down whenever I bring it up. I've read about the legends, the stories of strange creatures spotted in the Black Forest. Some call it a Dogman, others something older, something darker. I don't know what it was, but I know this: it wasn't an animal, it wasn't human, and it wasn't something you could fight or reason with. If you ever find yourself in those woods, and you hear the growl, run. Leave everything behind and don't look back, because once it sees you, it doesn't stop. Story number 5. The Dogman and the Giant Tracks of Wisconsin. There's something about the forests in Wisconsin that feels ancient, as if they've been there longer than time itself. The Kettle Moraine State Forest is no exception. Its rolling hills and dense woods seem to hum with a quiet kind of menace, like they're keeping secrets they don't want to share. It's the kind of place where you feel watched, even when you're alone. I didn't believe the stories about Dogman when we went camping there. I thought they were just old tales, made to scare kids and sell books. But after that weekend, I'll never doubt them again. It was late September when my friends and I decided to spend a weekend in Kettle Moraine. There were 4 of us: me, my best friend Tyler, his girlfriend Lisa, and her brother Jake. We were all seasoned campers, the kind of people who thought nothing could rattle us. Tyler had heard the stories about Dogman and thought it would be funny to camp in the heart of the forest. "It's just a big wolf or a bear," he said as we drove out. "People like to exaggerate." I wish he'd been right. We arrived at our campsite in the late afternoon, a small clearing off a narrow dirt trail deep in the forest. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air had that crisp, autumn chill. The place was beautiful, almost too perfect. I remember thinking how quiet it was: no birds, no insects, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By the time we set up the tents and got a fire going, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving us in darkness. We ate dinner, shared a few beers, and laughed as Tyler tried to scare us with stories about Dogman. "They say it's like a werewolf," he said, grinning as he waved his flashlight under his chin. "Big, hairy, and smarter than a regular animal. It watches you from the trees, waits until you're alone, and then..." He clapped his hands together, making Lisa jump. "You're done. Cut it out," Lisa said, glaring at him. "It's not funny." Jake laughed, but even he seemed uneasy. I tried to play along, but something about the forest felt wrong. The shadows beyond the firelight seemed deeper than they should have been, and the silence felt heavy, oppressive. The first sign of trouble came around midnight. We were sitting by the fire when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo through the trees. It was faint at first, almost like a trick of the wind, but then it came again, louder this time, deep and resonant. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What the hell was that?" Lisa whispered, clutching her jacket. "Probably just a wolf," Tyler said, though his voice wasn't as confident as before. "There are plenty of them around here." "That didn't sound like a wolf," Jake said, his eyes darting to the trees. The growl came again, followed by a loud crack, like a tree snapping in half. We all froze, staring into the darkness. The sound was close, too close, and whatever had made it was big. Tyler grabbed his flashlight and shined it toward the noise. The beam swept across the trees, revealing nothing but branches and shadows. But then, for a split second, I saw them, two glowing eyes, reflecting the light like red embers. They were high off the ground, too high for any normal animal. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "What?" Tyler asked, his voice trembling. "Eyes," I said. "Up there." Tyler swung the flashlight back, but the eyes were gone. The growling stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. The ground seemed to vibrate with each step, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, clutching our flashlights and staring into the darkness. Eventually, the forest seemed to settle, and Tyler tried to laugh it off. "Probably just a bear," he said, though none of us believed him. We crawled into our tents, but I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, made my heart race. At one point, I thought I heard something sniffing near the tent, but when I peeked out, there was nothing there. The next morning, the real horror began. When we stepped out of the tents, the first thing we noticed was the smell. A foul, acrid stench that clung to the air, like a mix of wet fur and rotting meat. It was so strong it made my stomach turn. Then we saw the tracks. They were massive, at least 18 inches long, with deep claw marks at the tips. They started near the edge of the clearing, leading straight to our tents, before circling back toward the trees. The ground around the tracks was torn up, as if something heavy had been pacing back and forth. "It was here," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "It was watching us." Tyler tried to play it off, but his hands were shaking. "Could have been a bear," he said weakly. "Bears have big feet. Bears don't walk like this," Jake said, pointing to the tracks. "And they don't come this close to people." We decided to pack up and leave. As we were stuffing our gear into our backpacks, I glanced up and froze. Standing on a hill about 50 yards away was a figure. It was tall, its dark silhouette stark against the pale morning light. Its body was covered in thick, black fur, and its head was distinctly wolf-like, with pointed ears and a long snout. It was just standing there, watching us, its glowing red eyes fixed on our camp. "Guys," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Look." The others turned, their faces pale as they followed my gaze. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stared, its presence heavy and oppressive, like it was daring us to make a move. "Let's go," Tyler said, his voice barely audible. We grabbed our gear and started walking, our eyes never leaving the figure on the hill. As we made our way down the trail, I kept expecting it to charge at us, but it stayed where it was, watching. When we reached the car, we threw our gear inside and climbed in. Slamming the doors shut, Tyler started the engine, and we sped down the road, the forest a blur around us. None of us spoke until we were miles away. Even now, I can still see those eyes in my mind, burning, unblinking, filled with a cold, predatory intelligence. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that the stories about Dogman aren't just stories. If you ever find yourself in Kettle Moraine, and you hear something growling in the dark, don't wait to see what it is. Run. Story number 6. The Howl in the Minnesota Woods. I never liked the Boundary Waters. Most people talk about it like it's paradise, a stretch of untamed wilderness where the lakes go on forever, and the trees whisper secrets only the wind can hear. But to me, there was always something unsettling about it. Maybe it was the way the forest seemed too quiet, or the way the shadows stretched too long when the sun went down, or maybe it was just my gut telling me to stay away. But that didn't stop my friends from convincing me to go camping there. I wish I'd trusted my gut. It was late September, just as the leaves had begun to turn. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Dylan, his girlfriend Kate, and her brother Mark. Dylan was the one who had planned the trip, saying it would be a perfect way to disconnect. He'd been to Boundary Waters a dozen times before and couldn't stop raving about its beauty. The first day was fine, beautiful, even. We paddled our rented canoe across the calm waters, the surface reflecting the red and gold canopy above us. We found a secluded spot to pitch our tents, a little clearing surrounded by towering pines. As the sun set, we cooked dinner over the fire and swapped stories, the flames casting flickering shadows across our faces. Felt like an adventure, a step back into something primal. And then the howling started. It was faint at first, just a long, mournful sound that seemed to drift through the trees. We all froze, straining to listen. "Wolf," Mark suggested, though he didn't sound sure. "Maybe," Dylan said, but his brow furrowed. The howl came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't like any wolf I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, and it carried an odd cadence, almost like a voice trying to mimic a wolf's call. "What the hell is that?" Kate asked, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Probably just an animal," Dylan said, though his hand tightened around the flashlight. "Let's just stay by the fire." We tried to go back to our conversation, but the mood had shifted. Every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves set us on edge. The howling came again, this time from a different direction, as if whatever was making the sound was circling us. And then we heard the footsteps. It started with a soft crunch, like something heavy pressing into the underbrush. Then came another, and another, growing louder, more deliberate. Dylan stood, shining his flashlight toward the trees, but the beam revealed nothing but shadows. "Hello?" he called, his voice firm but uneasy. "Is someone out there?" No answer, just the sound of footsteps, now moving faster. "Maybe we should go inside the tents," Kate whispered. "No," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "If something's out there, I don't want to be trapped in a tent." The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the howling came again, so loud and close it made my chest tighten. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't anything natural. And that's when we saw it. It moved between the trees, a shadow too large and too fast to be a person. The flashlight caught a fleeting glimpse, tall, over 7 feet, with long arms that hung unnervingly low. It was covered in dark fur, its movements smooth and unnaturally quick for something its size. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. They glowed, reflecting the light like an animal's but burning with an intensity that felt wrong, predatory. "It's on 2 legs," Kate whispered, her voice trembling. The creature stopped, standing just at the edge of the firelight. For a moment, it seemed to study us, tilting its head as if curious. Then it opened its mouth, revealing jagged, yellow teeth, and let out a howl so loud and raw it felt like the trees themselves were shaking. "Get to the canoe," Dylan said, his voice shaking. "Now." We grabbed what we could and bolted, leaving the fire still burning as we ran toward the water. The creature roared behind us, and I could hear its footsteps pounding through the forest, getting closer with each stride. I glanced back and saw it, its massive form darting between the trees, its eyes locked on us. It moved like a predator, its long legs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. We reached the canoe and shoved it into the water, scrambling inside as the creature broke through the tree-line. It stopped at the edge of the shore, its massive claws sinking into the mud, and let out another howl. The sound echoed across the lake, bouncing off the trees like 100 voices crying out at once. As we paddled into the darkness, the creature stood there, watching us, its glowing eyes following our every move. The howling continued, now joined by the distant, answering calls of others. I don't know how many there were, but it sounded like the entire forest was alive with them. When we finally reached the other side of the lake, we didn't stop paddling until we found a ranger station. The ranger listened to our story, his face pale, but he didn't offer any explanation. "You're not the first," he said finally, "and you won't be the last. I haven't been back to Boundary Waters since that night, and I don't plan to. I've read the stories, the legends about Dogman sightings in Minnesota, and I've seen enough to know they're more than just tales. If you ever find yourself camping near Boundary Waters and hear a howl in the night, don't try to find its source. Don't wait to see what's out there, because once it sees you, there's no escaping it." Story number 7. The Dogman of Lake Superior. When you think of Lake Superior, you think of its vast, endless expanse of water, calm on the surface but hiding something ancient and unknowable beneath. I'd heard stories about the lake all my life, ghost ships, strange lights, even tales of creatures that shouldn't exist. But I'd always brushed them off as legends, the kind of campfire tales meant to give you a good scare before bed. That was before that night, before I saw it with my own eyes. Now, I don't think they're stories at all. It was late October 2018, just before the first heavy snow of the season. My friends and I had planned one last camping trip before winter shut us in. The idea was simple: hike to a remote spot on the shores of Lake Superior, pitch our tents, and spend the weekend fishing, drinking, and swapping stories under the stars. There were 4 of us: me, my best friend Mike, his girlfriend Katie, and her brother Josh. We'd been camping together for years, and the thought of being out there, far from the noise and stress of the city, was enough to make the long drive worth it. We set up camp on a stretch of beach flanked by towering pine trees, with a view of the lake that stretched to the horizon. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of the waves and the occasional call of a bird. It was perfect, until the sun went down. The first sign that something was wrong came just after dinner. We were sitting around the fire, the flames crackling in the cold night air, when we heard it, a long, low howl that seemed to rise out of the darkness. "What was that?" Katie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A wolf, probably," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. "It didn't sound like a wolf," Josh said. "It sounded bigger." The howl came again, louder this time, and closer. It echoed off the trees, filling the night with a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just an animal. But the mood had shifted. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence as we huddled closer to the fire. The lake, so calm and inviting during the day, now seemed vast and menacing, its dark surface rippling in the moonlight. Then came the sound of movement, branches snapping, leaves rustling, just beyond the circle of light from the fire. "Probably a deer," Mike said, though he gripped the flashlight a little tighter. But it wasn't a deer. The sound of footsteps grew louder, heavier, circling the camp. I stood, shining my flashlight into the trees, but the beam cut through nothing but shadows. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was the pounding of my heart. And then we heard the growl. It was deep, guttural, and far too loud to be any animal I'd ever heard. The sound seemed to vibrate through the ground, sending a chill down my spine. "What the hell is that?" Katie whispered, clutching Josh's arm. No one answered. We didn't have time to. It stepped into the firelight slowly, deliberately, as if it wanted us to see it. The creature was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, with a body covered in dark, matted fur, stood upright, its shoulders hunched and its long arms ending in claws that glinted in the firelight. Its face was the stuff of nightmares, a grotesque mix of man and wolf, with a long snout, sharp teeth, and eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow. For a moment, none of us moved. We were frozen, unable to look away from those eyes that seemed to pierce right through us. Then it let out a roar, a sound so loud and primal it felt like the earth itself was shaking. "Run!" Mike shouted, breaking the spell. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing whatever we could as we ran toward the trees. The creature roared again, and I could hear its footsteps pounding after us, faster and heavier than any human could move. Josh tripped, falling hard into the sand, and the creature was on him in an instant, but instead of attacking, it stopped, standing over him with its claws bared and its teeth inches from his face. It growled low and deep, as if warning him, before turning its glowing eyes toward the rest of us. "Get up!" I screamed, and Josh scrambled to his feet, his face pale as a ghost. We ran without stopping, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of the creature's pursuit filling the air. The beach gave way to dense forest, and the darkness closed in around us. I could hear it behind us, his growls growing louder, his footsteps shaking the ground. We reached the car, breathless and shaking, and threw ourselves inside. Mike jammed the keys into the ignition, and the engine roared to life as the creature burst from the trees, its eyes glowing in the headlights. It lunged at the car, its claws raking against the metal, leaving deep gouges in the doors. Mike floored the gas, and the car sped down the narrow dirt road, the creature chasing us, its long legs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. It followed us for what felt like miles, its massive form illuminated in the red glow of the taillights. Finally, as we reached the main road, it stopped, standing in the middle of the road and watching as we disappeared into the night. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of a motel hours away. None of us spoke as we checked in, our hands still trembling, our minds racing. That night, I dreamed of yellow eyes and sharp teeth, of growls that seemed to echo through the dark. The next day, we returned to the campsite with a ranger, hoping to retrieve our gear. The beach was deserted, our tents shredded, and the ground littered with massive footprints, each one larger than any human or animal I'd ever seen. The ranger didn't say much, but his face was pale as he examined the tracks. I don't know what we saw that night on the shores of Lake Superior. Some say it's the Dogman, a creature of legend that's been seen in these parts for over a century. Others say it's something older, something that doesn't belong in our world. What I do know is this: if you ever find yourself camping near the lake and hear a howl in the night, don't investigate, don't try to be brave, because once it sees you, it won't stop. Story number 8. The chase in Michigan's forest. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a chance for me and Emma to escape the noise of the city, to reconnect in the quiet serenity of the Manistee National Forest. We'd planned it for weeks, excited by the idea of campfires, hiking trails, and starlit skies. The forest was vast and dense, a place where you could lose yourself in nature and forget the world existed. We didn't know we'd find something else out there, or that it would find us. We set up camp late in the afternoon, near a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of moss and earth. It was the kind of place that felt untouched, where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we built a fire and cooked dinner. The flames cast long shadows across the trees, and the forest seemed to come alive with nocturnal sounds. It was peaceful, almost magical, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe, until we heard the first sound. It was faint at first, just the soft crunch of leaves somewhere in the distance. I dismissed it as an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but then it came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't just one sound, but a series of them, deliberate and heavy, like footsteps. "Do you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "Probably just a deer," I said, though I didn't believe it. The footsteps circled the camp, moving slowly, methodically, whatever it was. It wasn't afraid of us. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight. I stepped away from the fire, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The forest was dense, the shadows deep, and I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. But the footsteps stopped, and then we heard the breathing. It was low and guttural, a sound that made my stomach twist. The flashlight beam caught movement, just a flicker, something tall and fast darting between the trees. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No response, just the sound of leaves rustling and that awful breathing. Emma grabbed my arm. "Let's go inside the tent," she whispered. We retreated, zipping the tent shut and sitting in silence, our ears straining for any sign of movement. For a while, everything was quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the fire outside. And then came the scratching. It started at the base of the tent, soft at first, then more insistent, like claws raking against the fabric. Emma clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is it?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, grabbing the flashlight again. "Stay here." I unzipped the tent just enough to poke the flashlight out. The firelight had dimmed, and the clearing was bathed in shadows. First, I didn't see anything, and then it stepped into the light. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs. His body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its arms were long, ending in clawed hands. But it was the face that froze me in place. A grotesque mix of human and wolf, with a long snout, sharp teeth, and eyes that glowed amber in the firelight. The creature stared at me, its chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. Then it let out a growl, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath me. "Get in the car," I whispered to Emma, my voice shaking. "Now." We bolted from the tent, grabbing only the car keys as we sprinted toward the vehicle parked 100 feet away. The creature roared, the sound primal and deafening, and I could hear its footsteps pounding behind us. "Don't look back," I told Emma, though I couldn't resist glancing over my shoulder. It was chasing us, moving impossibly fast for something so large. Its claws tore through the ground. Its eyes locked on us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. We reached the car and scrambled inside, slamming the doors just as the creature reached us. It lunged at the car, its claws scraping against the metal, leaving deep gouges in the door. Emma screamed as I fumbled with the keys, finally jamming them into the ignition and starting the engine. The creature roared again, slamming its fists against the hood as I threw the car into reverse and backed away. Its eyes never left us, even as we sped down the dirt road, the tires kicking up gravel and dust. But it didn't stop. The creature followed us, running alongside the car, his claws raking against the windows. I floored the gas pedal, the speedometer climbing as the narrow road blurred around us. But no matter how fast we went, kept pace, its long legs propelling it forward with terrifying ease. "Go faster," Emma screamed, her hands gripping the dashboard. "I'm trying," I shouted back. Finally, the road curved, leading us toward the main highway. The creature slowed, its massive frame disappearing into the shadows as we left the forest behind. But its eyes stayed with me, burning into my memory. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of a motel miles away. Inside, we locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat in silence, our hearts still racing. The next morning, we returned to the campsite with a park ranger. The clearing was a mess, the tent shredded, the fire pit overturned, and the ground littered with massive footprints. The ranger tried to explain it away as a bear, but we knew better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything natural. I haven't been back to the Manistee Forest since that night, and I don't plan to. The stories of the Michigan Dogman are no longer just stories to me. They're a warning. If you ever hear footsteps outside your tent in the middle of the night, don't investigate. Don't wait to see what's out there, because if you see it, it's already too late. Story number 9. Eyes in the Dark of Texas. The Big Thicket in Texas is the kind of place where legends thrive. With its endless woods and thick underbrush, it's easy to feel small, even lost, under the weight of the trees. People tell stories about strange things out there, ghosts, mysterious lights, creatures that don't belong. I never gave much thought to those tales. Not until the night I saw the eyes in the dark. It was late October, one of those unseasonably warm evenings where the air feels thick and alive. Me, my cousin Matt, and our friends Alex and Rachel decided to camp in the big thicket. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Just us, the stars, and the sound of crickets to lull us to sleep. We found a spot deep in the woods, far from the well-traveled trails. Matt insisted it was the best way to experience the thicket, away from the noise of other campers. By the time we pitched our tents and got the fire going, the sun was gone, leaving the forest wrapped in darkness. The first few hours were perfect. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, drank a few beers, and laughed as Matt tried to scare us with tales of the Dogman. He claimed it was a creature part man, part wolf, with glowing red eyes and a howl that could freeze your blood. People say it hunts in the big thicket, Matt said, his voice low and theatrical. It watches from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Come on, Alex said, rolling his eyes. You don't really believe that, do you? Maybe, Matt said with a grin. But you can't deny it's creepy out here. Rachel shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Let's talk about something else. We laughed, letting the tension ease. The fire crackled, the shadows danced, and for a while, felt like any other camping trip. Then the woods went silent. It was subtle at first. The chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, all of it stopped. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Felt like the forest was holding its breath. Do you hear that? Rachel whispered. Hear what? Alex asked, though his voice was tight. Exactly, Rachel said. It's too quiet. Matt shrugged. Probably just a predator nearby. Happens all the time. But even he didn't sound convinced. That's when I saw them. Two red lights, low to the ground, just beyond the edge of the firelight. First, I thought they were reflections. Maybe the eyes of a deer caught in the flickering flames. But as I stared, the lights rose higher, standing level with my own eyes. They weren't just glowing, they were burning, like embers smoldering in the dark. There's something out there, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The others followed my gaze. Rachel gasped, clutching Alex's arm. What is that? Matt grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the eyes. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the thing watching us. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur that gleamed in the light. Its arms were long, ending in clawed hands that hung at its sides. Its legs bent backward, like a dog's, but its torso was disturbingly human. And its face was the stuff of nightmares, long and wolf-like, with a mouth full of sharp teeth that gleamed as it curled into a snarl. The eyes burned brighter, locking onto us with a predatory hunger that made my stomach churn. For a moment, none of us moved. We were frozen, caught between disbelief and sheer, primal terror. Then it growled. The sound was low and guttural, vibrating through the ground beneath us. It wasn't just a growl, it was a warning, promise of violence. The creature took a step forward, its claws sinking into the earth. Run, Matt said, his voice trembling. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, stumbling over roots and rocks as we ran toward the car. The fire behind us flickered and died, plunging the forest into darkness. The creature roared, a deafening sound that sent chills racing down my spine. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. It wasn't running, it didn't need to. It was chasing us, herding us like prey. Faster, Alex shouted, his voice breaking. The car was parked just off a narrow dirt road, and when I saw it, relief flooded through me. But the sound of the creature was closer now, the snapping of branches and the growling growing louder with every step. We reached the car and threw ourselves inside. Matt fumbling with the keys. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped them twice before finally getting the engine started. The headlights blazed to life, illuminating the road ahead and the creature standing just a few feet away. It was even bigger up close, his fur slick with sweat, his teeth bared in a snarl. It lunged at the car, its claws scraping against the metal as Matt slammed on the gas. The tires spun for a moment before catching, and we sped down the road, the creature's glowing eyes burning in the rearview mirror. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the forest a distant blur behind us. No one spoke, no one dared to look back. When we finally reached the safety of a gas station, we climbed out of the car, our legs trembling, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The car had deep scratches along the passenger side, gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws, and on the dusty rear window, there was a single handprint, massive, inhuman, and unmistakable. We never went back to the big thicket. To this day, I can't step foot in the woods without feeling that thing watching me, its red eyes burning in the darkness. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. If you ever find yourself in the big thicket and the woods go silent, leave. Don't wait. Don't look. Just run. Because some legends are real, and they're hungry. Story number 10. Dogman's attack in Talladega. Camping in the Talladega National Forest was supposed to be an escape, a weekend to breathe fresh air, disconnect, and feel a little braver under the canopy of towering pines. I thought I knew what fear was: ghost stories around campfires, the occasional sound of a branch snapping in the dark. But I didn't know real fear, not until that night. It was early November when my friends and I set out for Talladega. There were 5 of us: me, my girlfriend Abby, her brother Dave, and 2 of our college friends, Nate and Sarah. We'd been planning the trip for weeks, eager to spend a weekend away from school and work. None of us knew that by the time the weekend was over, we'd leave more than just our gear behind. The day we arrived was perfect. The sun was bright, the air crisp, and the forest alive with the sound of rustling leaves and chirping birds. We found a secluded clearing a couple of miles off the main trail, surrounded by trees so dense they felt like walls. It was quiet, peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. By the time the sun set, we'd set up 2 tents, started a fire, and were roasting hot dogs while Nate told a story about the supposed Dogman. He was grinning, his flashlight under his chin as he described the creature, half man, half dog, with glowing eyes and claws sharp enough to tear through metal. They say it roams forests like this, he said, his voice low and dramatic. Watching, waiting, and when it strikes, you won't even see it coming. Cut it out, Sarah said, rolling her eyes. You're going to scare yourself more than us. But Nate wasn't the only one who seemed nervous. Dave kept glancing over his shoulder, his laughter forced. Even Abby, who usually rolled her eyes at this kind of stuff, had gone quiet. Relax, I said, trying to lighten the mood. The only thing out here is us and a bunch of squirrels. I wish I'd been right. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. The fire had burned low, and we were all in our tents, drifting off to sleep. I woke up to a sound, soft at first, like something scraping against the side of the tent. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, louder this time, deliberate. Did you hear that? Abby whispered, her voice trembling. Probably just an animal, I said, though my pulse was already racing. Then came the growl. It was low and guttural, like the sound of an engine struggling to start, and it sent chills down my spine. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. Too deep for a dog, too menacing for a bear. Sounded wrong, like it didn't belong. Is that? Abby didn't finish her sentence. Before I could answer, there was a sudden, violent tearing sound. The side of the tent ripped open, and a clawed hand, massive, black-furred, and tipped with razor-sharp nails, reached inside, swiping at the air. Run, I shouted, grabbing Abby's arm and pulling her out of the tent through the opposite side. The campsite was chaos. Nate and Sarah were already out of their tent, their faces pale in the dim light of their flashlights. Dave stumbled out behind them, his eyes wide with terror, and then we saw it. The creature was standing by the fire, its massive frame illuminated by the dying flames. It was at least 7 feet tall, with powerful, muscular limbs and a body covered in thick, matted fur. His head was unmistakably canine, with pointed ears, a long snout, and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. He snarled, baring teeth that looked like they could crush bone, and swiped at the tent again, shredding it like paper. The sound of fabric tearing filled the air, mingling with the creature's deep, guttural growls. "We have to go," Nate said, his voice shaking. "No time for the gear," I shouted, already running toward the car. The creature roared, a sound so loud and primal it seemed to shake the ground beneath us. We sprinted through the forest, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind us, I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps, the crack of branches snapping under the weight of something massive. "Faster!" Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. The car was parked a quarter-mile away, but it felt like an eternity before we reached it. By the time we burst into the clearing where we'd left it, my legs were trembling, and my chest felt like it might explode. Nate fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before finally unlocking the doors. We piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the creature burst into the clearing. For a moment, it stood there, its glowing eyes locked on us. Its fur glistened in the moonlight, and its teeth gleamed as it snarled, saliva dripping from its jaws. It was like something out of a nightmare, too large, too menacing to be real. Then it lunged. The car roared to life, and Nate floored the gas. The tires spun for a moment before catching, and we sped down the narrow dirt road, the creature's footsteps pounding behind us. I looked back and saw it chasing us, its movements unnervingly fast and fluid, like it was built to hunt. Just when I thought it might catch us, it stopped. It stood there in the middle of the road, watching as we disappeared into the night. The next day, we returned with the park rangers to retrieve our gear. The campsite was destroyed, both tents were shredded, and the ground was littered with claw marks and deep footprints. The prints were massive, over a foot long, with distinct claw marks at the tips. The rangers exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say much. We didn't need them to. We knew what we'd seen. I haven't been back to Talladega since that night. I still dream about it sometimes, those glowing eyes, that guttural snarl, the feeling of being hunted. People laugh when I tell them the story, say it was just a bear or a trick of the light. But I know the truth. There's something in those woods, something that doesn't belong. And if you ever find yourself in the Talladega National Forest and hear a growl in the dark, do yourself a favor. Don't stay to find out what it is. Thank you for joining us on this hair-raising journey through the forests where Dogman prowls. From the glowing eyes in Big Thicket to the spine-chilling howls in Minnesota. These tales remind us that some legends might be closer to the truth than we'd like to believe. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another dive into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, in the heart of the woods, you're never truly alone.